10 spot, we have the aggressive girl. When this storyteller was younger, she was put into a psych ward after threatening to take her own life. She had only been in there one day before this incident happened. She was sitting on her bed just reading when, all of a sudden, she heard screaming in the halls. Then, less than a minute later, a girl in her 20s or so kicked down her door and was just staring at her with a devilish look and a sharp object in her hand. The storyteller sat there frozen looking at the girl when all of a sudden 2 bodyguards tackled the devilish girl to the ground. The girl was then dragged away and put into the quiet room. When the doctor came in, they told the patient that all was well and asked her if she wanted to still take her own life. The girl said nope, and she was then released one day later. In our number 9 spot, we have no friends. When this storyteller was a med student and he was shadowing a resident and doing psych clerkship, he came across a patient who had been struggling with schizophrenia and with hearing voices in his head. The resident he was shadowing asked him what the voices would say to him, and he didn't want to answer the question. Apparently, he was then offered some meds to make the voices go away, and he didn't want to take them. When the resident asked him why he didn't want to take them, he replied that they were his only friends. In our number 8 spot, we have the lollipop. This is a story told by a nurse that worked in a ward and was being informed about a new patient that had been checked in. This is a patient that was being treated for many problems, but learning about his history really freaked her out. Apparently, one day he wanted a lollipop from his mom and she wouldn't give him one. So he decided to purposely drown his toddler brother because she refused. When the nurse got a good look at the patient, she said it was like there was no life behind his eyes. He was stark cold and terrifying. No humanity was left. In our number 7 spot, we have cat sounds. This is a story about a guy who was working as a nurse on a ward when he got talking to one of the patients that he was taking care of. The patient was talking to him about why he was in there and proceeded to tell the nurse that he beat up his cat and it got very injured. When the nurse asked him why he beat up his cat, the guy said that he liked the noises his cat made as he punched him. Oh gosh. In our number 6 spot, we have Baby Doll. This story is told by a nursing assistant that would assist a sweet old lady with dementia in one of the wards. She had other psychological issues too, so that's why she was in there. This old woman believed herself to be a mother, and she had a baby doll that she would hold and believe it to be her child, and each night the nursing assistant would watch her tuck the baby in. She had her own little bed for the baby. She would also think herself to be pregnant at times, and when the baby was due and she wouldn't have the baby, she would get depressed and angry for about a month, until she thought herself to be pregnant again. One night the nursing assistant saw that she had forgotten to tuck her baby in, and so he said that he would help her. The woman punched the assistant right in the throat, and he fell to the floor gasping for air when the woman continued to hit him and say that he was driving too fast and that he destroyed everything she loves. Later on, after this incident, the assistant discovered that the woman had once lost her 1-year-old and husband in a car accident when she was pregnant, and she was so distraught that she ended up giving her baby up for adoption. The assistant felt that it was as if she was in her own personal hell, reliving those memories over and over again. So sad. In our number 5 spot, we have the chemically induced psychosis. This was a story told by a ward assistant that came across a young man who was suffering from an illicit substance-induced psychosis. This patient was taken to this hospital and had been there for over a month with no signs of remission. He had all of the psychotic behaviors while he was in there. But what was horrific to witness was the moments when he would come out of it and popped into reality. He would have a look of sheer terror, and his shaky voice always stuck in this assistant's mind. His family would be so sad and have a hard time visiting him when they did. I really can't imagine how this family must have felt to have to witness this. It's truly very haunting. In our number 4 spot, we have a handful of daisies. This is the story of a woman who was a patient at a ward as she was suffering from psychosis for many years. When she was young, she witnessed the brutal killing of her mother. Apparently, she went missing for a few days and was found completely completely distraught. Her psychosis got worse over the years, and she would yell and scream the most horrific, sad things every so often. She did have a lot of good days though, where she would be pretty lucid, and she would take a cab to town when all of the staff was distracted with lunch. She would buy herself a handful of daisies and then take a cab back. The staff would be frantically looking for her, of course, when an angry cab driver would pull up demanding to be paid. In our number 3 spot, we have the Red Shirt Man. This story is told by a nurse assistant who was working in a psych ward and was introduced to a very ill man with psychosis. The man was wearing a bright red shirt and looked disheveled. In minutes of meeting him, he had shouted all kinds of profanity at him. He was told to be weary of him. One day, he was given the task to check up on him and drop off some food for him. He was reluctant to do so, as most of the staff were afraid of this guy, as he was quite often very aggressive. When he approached his room, he knocked and asked him if he could come in. Silence. He knocked again, and still silence. So he announced that he was coming in regardless. He opened the door to find the man sitting on his bed, cross-legged, wearing his red shirt again, and staring at him with blood running down his nose. He must have hit himself or had done something to injure himself. When the assistant asked if he needed any help, the patient threatened to kill him and said his deceased father was going to help him. He quickly left the room and closed the door and asked to never see that patient again. He was pretty sure that there was some kind of demon inside of him. In our number 2 spot, we have the Nightly Screams. This is a story about a mental asylum from the early 1900s. This story is told by a woman named Nellie, who stayed in an asylum for 10 days undercover to see what the conditions were like. Apparently, every night she experienced what the nurses called the nightly screams. Screams could be heard every night from some of the same rooms, and some were different. Nellie reported that one night she heard a woman pray and beg for death, while on another night she heard a woman repeatedly shout, "Kill!" Well, that must have been horrific to witness. In our number 1 spot, we have the Spanish Demons. One night in a ward while on the night shift, a nurse heard a man freaking out. This man was from South America, and he was known to speak in Spanish from time to time. On this night, he was screaming and yelling about demons coming to get him in Spanish. She tried to do what she could to calm him down, but didn't have much luck, until he just abruptly stopped screaming and went dead silent. He was looking at something behind the nurse, which completely freaked her out enough to look behind her, and of course nothing was there. But he kept looking until she decided it was time to exit the room. She apparently didn't get much sleep that night, which makes sense. I don't think I would either.
Starting off this countdown, we have Rolling Hills Asylum. Established in 1827, the Rolling Hills Asylum was originally a working farm that was converted into a home for the less fortunate. Then it went on to be a place for widows, orphans, alcoholics, criminals, and individuals with mental illnesses. But it closed its doors in 1974. Apparently, it's said that over 1,700 people died there. Hundreds are currently buried all over the property in unmarked graves, which makes this place very haunted. Visitors claim to have heard screaming and doors slamming. Others have seen the apparition of Roy Cruz, a 7.5-foot tall man who died there in 1942. And the hospital even has something known as a shadow hallway, a hallway where you can see tons of ghostly apparitions. Moving on to number 9, we have Topeka State Hospital. The Topeka State Hospital, located in Kansas, operated from 1872 to 1997. And this hospital, much like the others on this list, has quite a dark history. So apparently in the early 20th century, a reporter visited the facility and witnessed some terrifying things. He said that he saw a patient that had been strapped down for so long that his skin was growing over the restraints, and there were other patients that were chained up like animals. But a majority of them just sat in the hallways on a rocking chair, rocking back and forth, staring at the walls all day. That's something straight out of a horror film. In our 8th spot, we have the Alegheny Lunatic Asylum. The Alegheny Lunatic Asylum began operating in 1964 and was designed to only hold 250 patients. However, it was soon housing more than 2,400 patients, which was very problematic. The place was extremely overcrowded and patients started to become more and more violent. Soon they were starting fires and attacking the staff. In 1994, the asylum was forced to close due to a lot of violations. Now it's said that the building is haunted from the souls of the mistreated patients. In fact, the building is open to ghost tours if you want to go do some exploring. In our 7th spot, we have the Metropolitan State Hospital. Located in Massachusetts, this hospital opened in 1930 for patients with mental illnesses. But in 1980, something sinister happened that gave the hospital the nickname the Hospital of Seven Teeth. So back in 1978, a patient named Anna Marie Davy went out for a walk on the grounds, but she never returned. In 1980, the patient Melvin Wilson came forward saying that he had killed her and buried her body parts all around the grounds. Not only that, he kept 7 of her teeth as souvenirs. Hence the nickname, the Hospital of Seven Teeth. But that's not the only bad thing to happen there. Years before this incident, in the 1960s, a bunch of patients were accidentally poisoned, but this has never been confirmed. In 1992, the hospital was closed after psychiatric care in Massachusetts became more privatized. In our 6th spot, we have Rancho Los Amigos. In 1888, Rancho Los Amigos, located close to downtown LA, was originally created to assist people living in poverty. Over time, the hospital expanded and was home to the elderly, homeless, and individuals with disabilities. But over the years, it ended up changing to become mainly a mental hospital. The hospital was in full operation until the 1950s, when it started to shut down its wards, including the mental hospital. That's when they discovered the hospital had a more dark past. In 2006, after the hospital was abandoned, a freezer was discovered in the morgue. Inside of it were mummified, amputated limbs, and brain tissue samples. Guess they didn't want to take that with them. But this makes you wonder what really went down in this hospital. The original building is now abandoned, but it has moved to another location and is now called Rancho Los Amigos National Rehabilitation Center. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with Creedmoor Psychiatric Hospital. Back in 1912, this hospital opened up in Queens, New York for individuals that were said to be mentally ill. Most of the patients had psychosis or schizophrenia. It started off as a small institution with only 32 patients, but in 1959 it housed more than 7,000 patients. As a result, the hospital was very crowded and understaffed. In the 1970s, rumors spread like wildfire about murders, attacks, and suicides all happening in the hospital. In fact, it's said that one nurse hit a patient in a straitjacket across the throat with a club, which ended up crushing his throat, and as a result, he died from asphyxiation. Shortly after, the asylum was closed and left to rot. Making our way down the list, number 4, we have the Gangjam Psychiatric Hospital. This next abandoned hospital is named one of the most haunted places in South Korea, and one of the freakiest places in the world. In fact, it's home to tons of urban legends. One legend states that the owner of the hospital was insane and kept the patients as his prisoners. Another version of the legend states that patients at the hospital started dying mysteriously, and that's what forced the hospital to close. In reality, the hospital closed in the 90s due to unsanitary conditions and lack of funding. Apparently because of this, the owner left the country, leaving no documentation behind about this building, so it was just abandoned. But to this day, people are convinced that the hospital is haunted. In fact, thousands of people break into the hospital each year just for the chance to catch a ghost. In our 3rd spot, we have the Zelda Fitzgerald Sanatorium. Built in 1859, this sanatorium, once called Tioranda, was originally built for the Civil War officer General Joseph Howland. Then in 1915 it was converted into a psychiatric hospital. In 1934, novelist F. Scott Fitzgerald took his wife Zelda there with hopes to cure her schizophrenia. Hence why people now refer to it as the Zelda Fitzgerald Sanatorium. However, it is probably most known for housing the patient Frances Seymour, aka actress Jane Fonda's mother. Frances ended up taking her own life there after cutting her throat with a razor in 1942. In 1999, the hospital closed and of course is now said to be haunted. And in our number 1 spot we have Waverly Hills Sanatorium. Located in Kentucky, this hospital was originally built in 1910 as a hospital for patients with tuberculosis. Sadly, tons of patients ended up dying from the disease. The hospital did more harm than good. Rumor goes that the hospital was mistreating their patients and conducting experiments on them. In fact, they had an area in the hospital called the death tunnel or body chute where they would dump the deceased. It's also said that one nurse hung herself in room 502, and in that same room another nurse died from falling out of the window. The hospital closed in 1961 upon the discovery of an antibiotic that could treat and cure tuberculosis. As a result, there was no need for the hospital. Now it's said that it's an extremely haunted building. Apparently, people have seen tons of apparitions there. The most famous one being of a boy named Timmy, who likes to play with rubber balls. He also likes to run from room to room. It's said that if you roll a small ball down a hallway, then Timmy will roll it back to you. Also, why are all ghosts either named like Timmy or Tommy? That's what I need to know.
In our number 10 spot, we have Miss Louise. Miss Louise was an older patient in an asylum who would often sleep talk, but this wasn't your ordinary sleep talking. Her eyes would every so often open, and sometimes she would be sitting up. Oh, terrifying. She wouldn't remember anything that happened when she awoke, which made witnessing her even creepier. Apparently, she has spoken about people who were once there, including a guy who had passed away and a girl that hangs around her and her dead husband who is always looking out for her. One of the nurses recalled a time when Miss Louise was sleep talking and she heard her saying, "Shh, better not talk too loudly. They're all sleeping. Let's talk about it later." Wild and creepy and cool at the same time. Coming up at our number 9 spot, we have Possessed Jane. There was once a woman named Jane who lived at a facility. On her first night at the facility, she was found in a pile of blood. Apparently, she had been cutting her skin around her shin with her fingernails and was pulling her skin up her leg. I may be sick. Apparently, she had a very methodical approach to her nighttime routine, going every night to each corner of her room and drawing the cross on the walls. Apparently, one night Jane was screaming late into the night, and when the night nurse went to ask her what was wrong, she responded, "What makes you think you are speaking to Jane?" Creepy. In our number 8 spot, we have the CIA test patient. Apparently, the person who is telling this story once had a very long conversation with a man from a mental facility, and this man claimed that the CIA was beaming thoughts into his head. Apparently, even though this seems like a crazy thought, he made a very interesting point. The man said that if the CIA were going to test products that could send ideas or thoughts into another person's head, of course they're going to use the people that the public already deems as crazy. Then no one would believe them even if they mentioned it. Not to mention they're already confined and being observed. They therefore make the best test subjects. Yeah. Whoa, that's such a good point. In our number 7 spot, we have the patient with the teddy bears. There was once a patient that had a collection of teddy bears. He was a young man and he just loved his teddy bears. It seemed to be completely harmless. Until one day a nurse walked into his room only to find him sitting cross-legged on the floor and all of the bears facing her. The man creepily smiled at her and said, "Their bears are going to eat you." And it's as if there was an echo in the room because he kept saying to her, "Eat you, eat you, eat you," until she got so creeped out that she closed the door and got her co-worker to take over. Apparently, the co-worker went into the room to find the man sleeping. Okay, so he was obviously possessed. I may not sleep tonight thinking about this man saying "eat you" over and over again. In our number 6 spot, we have the writings on the bed. This is a story told from the perspective of a nurse that worked on this ward, and he was approached by one of his patients, and she said that she found writings under her bed. Apparently, the beds in this ward were held by small wooden bed frames, so someone could have definitely crafted a message on the wood. The nurse wondered what the patient was doing under the bed in the first place, but attested it to something strange and abnormal that he would usually see on this floor. Anyways, one day he went to the patient's room and she showed him the writings, and sure enough, they were there. There were stories written on the wood. After this, somebody went to check all of the beds, and apparently they all had writings on them. Plans of people taking their own lives, stories of their daily life, and who the bad nurses were. It really creeped the nurse out. Honestly, I probably would have written under the bed as well. I remember I did that once when I was young with an old coffee table my family had. It was like a diary after some time had passed, so yeah, I was a special child. In our number 5 spot, we have the Stephen King Man. There was once a patient who was in a ward, but also had been struggling with a few other health problems, so he was attached to an oxygen tank, an IV, and a heart monitor. This guy apparently acted as if he was in a Stephen King novel. The volunteer that was working there was sitting with a few patients, including this guy, and this guy mistakenly thought that he was a psychiatrist, probably because he was holding a clipboard. Anyways, the patient started talking to him and asking for his opinion, and the volunteer just kept turning it around onto him and asking him what he thought about it. That kind of reminds me of Jamie Lee Curtis in Freaky Friday. And how do you feel about that? Anyways, this seemingly worked until the patient looked at him and said, quote, "You can be the next Messiah. Come here and let me teach you." He insisted that the volunteer sit beside him, but of course he refused and said, "That's okay." Eventually the patient said, "I see." And he began to take off his oxygen mask, his heart monitor, and detach the IV. The volunteer asked him why he was doing this, and the patient said, "I can go now. My task is complete. You will not accept my teaching, and now I can die in peace knowing I tried." A nurse then showed up, and the volunteer quickly made his exit. I hope he updated the nurse, because that sounds pretty scary, and I hope that patient is alright. In our number 4 spot, we have Laughing John. This is a story that is actually told by someone who was once a patient in a psych ward. She was very familiar with the other people staying there, including a man named John. One day she was walking along the corridor when she heard John making really weird noises, laughing and talking to someone in the bathroom with him. She said she waited for him to leave for about 20 minutes, and the noises kept getting louder and louder, so she decided to do something. She opened the door to the bathroom, as they usually aren't locked here, and she saw John on the floor laughing, naked, covered in a pool of blood. He had broken a mirror and had begun to carve deep gashes in his arms and legs. She thought, he was going to die, so she rushed in to help him when he took the mirror shard and sliced her up with it. Her screams are what alerted the staff to come in and restrain him. Apparently, days later, she saw him and he had no recollection of the incident. Horrifying. In our number 3 spot, we have the Air Force pilot. This guy, who was newly admitted into a ward, spoke to one of the nurses about his past experiences. He mentioned that he was once a pilot for the Air Force, and he flew experimental planes because his blood was a bit abnormal and could withstand the G-force. Anyways, testing was done that proved this part of the story to be true, as his blood was naturally thin. So anyways, the nurse was at her desk relaying this story to another nurse when a resident started questioning her about it. Apparently, he used to be an Air Force pilot, and the place that this patient was referring to is a top secret place where there are no roads coming in or out of it. It's so secret that you wouldn't know about it unless you've gone there, and that she should not talk about it as she could get herself into trouble. Does that mean I should not talk about it now? Oh well, too late. In any case, I wonder if some experiments were done on this guy and that's why he needed psychiatric help. Crazy to think about what we don't know that might be happening in this world. In our number 2 spot, we have the Talking Old Lady. This is another story told by a patient who was once in a ward. She said that there was once an old lady that was right beside her room, and this old lady was constantly talking to her dead daughter. That's so sad. The older woman would seemingly be comforting her daughter and telling her how much she loved her, until one day something happened and the relationship seemingly took a turn. The old woman got super angry angry with her and started blaming her for everything, including for why her porridge was burnt, to making her live in such an uncomfortable place. The woman began crying all the time, and it was just horrible. The patient asked to change rooms because it was just too dark and sad to hear every single day. So understandable. In our number 1 spot, we have patients predict their own deaths. This is a story told by a nurse that specialized in geriatrics, and apparently she worked for several hospitals for many, many years. She would often talk about situations that would happen at her work. She would say that each of her patients weirdly tended to have a similar checklist that they would follow right before they were about to die. They would always die in a very similar way. They would talk to someone that wasn't there, usually a previous loved one that had passed away, and when they were asked about what they were talking about, they would say that they were told that they're ready to move on and that they will be taken the next day at a very specific time. Apparently, the patients would often die at the exact time their loved ones had said that they would.